The air in the Black Forest did not move like normal air. It was thick with the scent of pine needle sap and wet dirt, sticking to the lungs like cold syrup. Deep within this valley, where the sun surrendered to the canopy long before afternoon ended, sat the village of Iswald. The people here spoke softly, walked briskly, and never looked at the upper windows of the house at the end of the cobblestone road. That was the home of Master Klaus, the finest horologist in the empire, and a man who was quietly losing everything he loved to something no one could name. Master Klaus was not an unkind man, but he was built entirely of straight lines and predictable rhythms. His hands, perpetually stained with dark grease and brass dust, could assemble a pocket watch with 40 moving components in complete darkness. Yet despite his precision, his home was haunted by an impossible pattern. 8 years ago, his eldest daughter, Greta, vanished on the night of her 18th birthday. 4 years later, his second daughter, Marta, disappeared on the exact same night, under the exact same circumstances. No broken windows, no footprints in the mud, no notes left behind. The local constable wrote it off as rebellious young women escaping the suffocating quiet of the forest for the bright lights of Berlin. But the villagers knew better, and so did Julian. Julian was not a clockmaker's apprentice, though he wore the stained canvas apron and carried the velvet pouches of delicate screwdrivers that suggested he was. He was a private investigator, hired by Marta's former fiancé, a man who refused to believe his bride-to-be had simply walked away into the freezing midnight without her shoes or her cloak. Julian had spent 6 months securing a place in Klaus's workshop, learning the language of escapement wheels, mainsprings and balance wheels, waiting for the third cycle to complete itself. In 3 days, Clara, Klaus's youngest and last remaining daughter, would turn 18. The workshop was a labyrinth of brass, mahogany, and shadow. Hundreds of clocks covered the walls, each beating at a slightly different tempo, creating a chaotic blanket of sound that made a visitor's heart try to synchronize. With 3 different rhythms at once, Clara spent her days in the corner of this mechanical forest, sewing lace and preparing simple meals for her father and his apprentice. She was a pale girl with eyes the color of winter rain, carrying a quiet resignation that unnerved Julian. She did not act like a girl about to celebrate a milestone. She acted like a patient, sitting in a waiting room, listening for her name to be called. Every night at precisely 10 o'clock, Master Klaus would bid Julian good night, lock the main doors of the house, and retreat to his living quarters. But Julian never truly slept. From his small cot beneath the secondary workbench, he listened to the true life of the house. Every night at 3 in the morning, long after the village had gone dead quiet, a faint, rhythmic thrumming vibrated through the floorboards. It was not the crisp, metallic tick of a brass clock. It was a low, heavy, organic sound, a thudding weight that vibrated up through the soles of Julian's boots. Each time the sound began, Klaus's heavy footsteps would creak down the back hallway, descending into the cellar below the kitchen. On the eve of Clara's 18th birthday, the atmosphere in the house became suffocatingly tense. Master Klaus barely spoke. His fingers, usually so steady, trembled as he oiled a small gold pocket watch. Clara spent the afternoon packing no bags, making no plans, simply sitting by the hearth and watching the amber embers turn to ash. Julian knew that if he was going to discover the truth, it had to be tonight. At 2:45 in the morning, Julian slipped out of his thin blanket. He wore soft leather boots that made no sound against the worn pine floorboards. He carried a small brass lantern, its shutter closed, so only a thin sliver of warm light escaped, and a heavy iron key he had painstakingly copied from C. Klaus's ring using impression wax over a week ago. He crept past Clara's bedroom door. The room was deathly silent, the door slightly ajar. He glanced inside. Her bed was neatly made, empty, but her clothes still hung in the open wardrobe. Julian moved toward the kitchen, his breath hitching as the floorboards groaned beneath his weight. He reached the heavy oak door leading to the cellar. It was wrapped in bands of beaten iron, looking more like the entrance to a bank vault than a root cellar. He slid his key into the keyhole. The lock gave a heavy, wet click that sounded like a bone breaking in the quiet house. He turned the handle, pushed the door open just enough to slip through, and descended the steep stone stairs into the cold abyss below. The air in the cellar did not smell like damp earth or stored potatoes. It smelled of rendered beeswax, expensive linseed oil, and a strange, sweet scent that reminded Julian of dried flowers pressing against old parchment. As his boots touched the flagstone floor, the mysterious sound he had heard for weeks grew louder. It was a deep, resonant thump-thump, thump-thump pulsing once every few seconds. Julian opened the shutter of his lantern slightly wider, casting a yellow cone of light through the darkness. The cellar was immense, stretching far past the foundation of the house above, cutting deep into the bedrock of the mountain itself. Lining the walls were not shelves of jam or barrels of wine, but thousands of meticulously organized tools, specialized saws, bone-handling needles, glass vials filled with clear amber liquids, and giant spools of fine silver wire. In the center of the cavernous room stood 3 massive structures, wrapped in thick canvas dust sheets. They were towering shapes, easily 8 feet tall, standing like silent sentinels in the chill air. Julian's heart hammered against his ribs as he stepped closer to the first structure. He reached out with a trembling hand, grabbed the edge of the heavy canvas and pulled it down. The cloth hit the floor with a soft dust cloud puff, revealing a masterwork of horrific beauty. It was a tall, grandfather-style clock case carved from dark, polished walnut, but its design defied every law of traditional horology. The wood was carved to resemble interlocking ribs, curving gracefully inward to frame a glass viewing panel running down the center. Inside the glass sat no brass pendulum or lead weight. Instead, encased in a clear, thick resin that looked like solidified honey, was a human figure. Julian gasped, stepping back, almost dropping his lantern. It was Greta, the eldest daughter who had disappeared 8 years ago. She wore a high-collared blue dress, perfectly pressed. Her skin was not pale or decayed. It had the warm, soft bloom of a young woman, lost in a deep, dreamless sleep. Her eyes were gently closed, her lips slightly parted. And right in the center of her chest, visible through her dress where the fabric had been neatly cut away, was an intricate assembly of gold and ruby gears, turning lazily, driving a mechanical apparatus connected directly to her sternum. With every slow rotation of the main drive gear, her chest gently rose and fell, inhaling and exhaling a tiny puff of clear oil. Mist through a bronze valve fitted into her throat. The thump-thump sound was coming from inside her. It was her heart beating at a glacial, artificial pace held in a state of suspended animation by a clockwork mechanism that forced her body to live at 1/100th of normal human speed. 1 second of her life was being stretched across days. 1 year of her life would take a century to pass. Panicked, Julian ran to the second shape and tore the canvas away. There was Marta. She was preserved in the exact same fashion, encased in a cabinet of rosewood and glass. Her golden hair was braided with delicate brass wires that connected to tiny counterweights, running down the sides of the case. Her eyes were slightly open, staring forward with an expression of profound, motionless tranquility. Her heart, too, gave a low, rhythmic thud every few seconds, driven by an internal pendulum made of solid silver that ticked with absolute, terrifying precision. "They do not age, you know." A soft voice spoke from the shadows near the stairs. Julian spun around, drawing his small pocket knife and raising his lantern. Master Klaus stepped into the pale yellow light. He was not carrying a weapon. He wore his reading spectacles pushed up on his forehead and held a small bottle of golden lubricant in his left hand. His face looked hollow, worn down by decades of unimaginable grief and obsessive fixation. "You are insane," Julian whispered, his voice cracking as he backed up against Marta's glass casing. "You trapped them. You turned your own children into machines." "I saved them," Klaus corrected gently, his tone conversational, as if explaining a basic mathematical formula to a slow student. "Look at the world out there, Julian. War is brewing in the east. Consumption takes the young before they can blossom. Time rots everything it touches. It rusts steel, it decays wood, and it turns beautiful, innocent children into bitter, dying old women. I am a clockmaker. My duty is to stop the decay. They are alive in there. Julian yelled, the sound echoing off the damp stone walls. They are conscious. They are resting, Klaus said, taking a step forward, his eyes soft with a chilling kind of fatherly love. In their minds, time moves so slowly that 1,000 years feels like a single, quiet afternoon spent watching rain fall on a window pane. No pain, no sorrow, no aging. I have given them eternity. Where is Clara? Julian demanded, his knife point trembling in the cold air. What did you do to Clara? Klaus smiled, a slow, heartbreaking expression of pity. He pointed a thin, grease-stained finger toward the far corner of the subterranean room, where a third canvas-covered frame stood waiting. But this frame was open. The glass door of the third walnut case hung wide, its internal brass gears humming softly in anticipation, empty and clean. I did not do anything to Clara tonight, Klaus murmured. Before Julian could process the sentence, he felt a sudden icy sensation at the side of his neck. A smell hit his nostrils, the sharp, sweet scent of rendered beeswax and lavender. He tried to turn his head, but his muscles suddenly refused to respond to his brain. The knife slipped from his numb fingers, clattering uselessly onto the flagstones. The lantern tumbled from his grip, shattering its glass and casting long, dancing shadows across the ceiling before sputtering out, leaving only the dim moonlight filtering through the high ventilation grates. Julian collapsed to his knees, his body entirely paralyzed, though his eyes remained wide open, and his mind agonizingly clear. From behind him stepped Clara. She was not crying. She held a small silver syringe, its glass barrel empty, her fingers moving with the precise, practiced rhythm of someone who had rehearsed a routine 1,000 times. She looked down at Julian with her winter rain eyes, offering him a faint, sympathetic smile. Father did not take my sisters, Clara said, her voice soft and sweet, echoing the low thump-thump of the machines around them. We asked him to do it. When Greta turned 18, she saw what the world did to our mother as she withered away from disease. She asked Father to make her last forever. Then Marta asked, and tonight it was supposed to be my turn. She knelt beside Julian, gently adjusting his head so it rested comfortably against the base of the empty clock case. But Father is getting old, Clara whispered, brushing a stray lock of hair from Julian's cold forehead. His hands shake now. He cannot build the 4th clock he would need for himself when his time comes. He needs a keeper, someone to wind the mainsprings every 40 years, someone to oil the jewel bearings and clear the condensation from the glass. Master Klaus stepped up beside his daughter, placing a heavy, warm hand on her shoulder. He looked down at Julian with a mixture of sorrow and gratitude. You have keen eyes, young man, and a steady pulse, Klaus said softly, pulling a set of delicate brass calipers and a velvet roll of surgical tools from his coat pocket. You will make a fine custodian for my family. My daughter will guide your hands. It takes very little time to learn, and we have all the time in the world. Julian tried to scream, to kick, to tear himself away from the cold flagstones, but the compound in his veins locked his jaw in place. He could only watch as Clara picked up a measuring tape, carefully noting the distance between his collarbone and his heart, while her father began to set the gear ratios on the workbench behind them. The rhythmic thrumming of the 2 brass cases filled the silent room, beating in slow, immortal unison. Thump, 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 thump outside. The wind howled through the black forest, carrying off the fallen autumn leaves to rot in the dirt, while inside the cool dark stone, time simply stopped moving at all. Next, Story 2. The cold in Svalbard did not merely sit on the skin, it reached inside a person's chest and tried to stop their heart from beating. Out here, on the northern edge of the world, winter did not mean a few dark hours and frosty mornings. It meant 4 long, suffocating months where the sun dropped below the horizon and stayed there, leaving the endless, Arctic tundra buried under a heavy blanket of pitch-black darkness. Eric was the sole technician assigned to Outpost Zero, a small research cabin built high up on an isolated plateau overlooking the frozen fjord. His job was simple, dull, and completely lonely. He checked the weather instruments twice a day, measured the thickness of the ice pack, and transmitted a short status report via shortwave radio to the regional base in Longyearbyen every night at precisely 9 o'clock. For 6 weeks, his routine had been as predictable as the ticking of his wristwatch. He brewed strong black coffee, listened to the howling wind outside, and recorded endless columns of numbers into his leather-bound logbook. The cabin itself was an isolated box made of reinforced timber and steel beams, because the ground in Svalbard was permafrost permanently. Frozen soil mixed with ice, the entire structure was elevated 6 feet above the ground on massive, hollow steel stilts. This prevented the heat of the house from melting the frozen earth beneath it, which would cause the foundation to shift and collapse. The empty space beneath the floorboards was normally a dead zone, an open-air gap where the polar wind whipped through, carrying fine, sharp grains of hard snow across the frozen crust. It was during the 3rd week of the polar night that the silence began to change. Eric was sitting at his wooden desk, writing down the atmospheric pressure readings, when he heard a faint sound directly beneath his chair. It was a dull, heavy thump against the wooden floorboards. It sounded like someone tapping the underside of his room with the flat side of a heavy wooden block. 3 slow rhythmic hits, tap, tap, tap. Then silence returned, filled only by the hum of the diesel generator outside. Eric paused, his pen hovering just above the paper. He listened intently for several minutes, but the sound did not repeat. He shrugged his shoulders, convincing himself it was merely the steel stilts adjusting to a sudden drop in temperature. Metal expanded and contracted in extreme weather, often making strange popping and groaning noises that could trick an isolated mind into imagining things. He finished his report, sent his radio message, and turned off his light. The next night the sound returned, but this time it was louder. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from beneath his bed. Eric sat up in the dark, his breath turning to white mist in the chilly air of his bedroom. The interval between the taps was eerily consistent, spaced exactly 4 seconds apart. It did not sound like metal expanding under stress. It sounded deliberate, like a heavy instrument striking thick timber from directly underneath the house. Driven by a mixture of irritation and growing anxiety, Eric pulled on his heavy parkas, laced up his thermal boots, and grabbed a high-powered halogen flashlight. He stepped out onto the small wooden porch, where the wind hit his face like a handful of crushed glass. The outdoor temperature sat at 30 degrees below zero. He carefully walked down the snow-dusted metal steps, his boots crunching loudly on the packed ice, and crouched down to shine his light into the shadowy gap beneath the cabin floor. The bright beam of his flashlight cut through the dark, revealing the 4 thick steel stilts embedded deep into the ice layer. There was nothing there, just bare blue-gray ice and smooth gravel, frozen solid as concrete. The wind swept through the gap, whistling softly through the steel frame. Eric swept the light back and forth twice more, feeling like a fool standing out in the freezing dark. He shook his head, marched back upstairs, and went to bed, attributing the noise to his own tired mind playing tricks on him in the relentless darkness. By the 5th night, a massive Arctic blizzard slammed into the plateau, cutting off all communication with the outside world. The wind roared like a jet engine, shaking the entire cabin until the coffee mugs rattled in the kitchen cupboards. The radio unit hummed with dead static, unable to push a signal through the wall of swirling snow. Eric was trapped inside his tiny wooden box, completely cut off from humanity, listening to the mountain scream. At 3 o'clock in the morning, while the storm raged at its peak, the noise returned, but it was no longer coming from just one spot. Tap, tap, tap. The strikes were heavier now, causing the wooden floorboards beneath his feet to vibrate slightly. It was moving. The sound started near the kitchen, slowly slid down the length of the hallway. and came to a stop directly beneath the center of his living room. Eric couldn't take it anymore. The claustrophobia and the endless noise were driving him toward a breakdown. He grabbed a heavy crowbar from his toolkit and his flashlight, determined to find whatever debris or loose pipe was banging against the timber in the wind. He slammed his face into his thick hood, opened the heavy outer door, and pushed himself out into the freezing fury of the storm. The cold was blinding. Snow swirled around him in thick white sheets, reducing his visibility to less than 3 feet. Holding onto the wooden handrail so he wouldn't be blown off the plateau, Eric crept down the icy steps and crawled underneath the belly of the cabin. He dropped to his knees on the frozen ground, shielded his eyes from the biting wind, hand clicked on his heavy flashlight. The beam illuminated the underside of the floorboards. The wood was clean, intact, with no loose boards or dangling wires. But as he dropped the light lower, angling the beam toward the ground beneath his knees, his throat went bone dry and his body went entirely rigid. The ground beneath the cabin was not just soil. It was a deep, crystal-clear glacier bed of ancient permafrost. The heat from his cabin, combined with an unusual geothermal shift deep within the rock, had caused the surface, layer of ice beneath the house, to melt slightly during the summer and refreeze into a mirror-smooth sheet of transparent blue ice during the winter. Directly below his living room floor, buried 3 feet beneath the surface of the clear ice, was a human body. Eric gasped, stepping back so quickly he nearly lost his footing. He pointed the shaking light downward, staring through the crystal-clear frozen layer. The body belonged to a man wearing an old-fashioned, faded red thermal suit from the late 1970s, the kind used by early geological survey teams that used to map the Svalbard wilderness decades ago. His face was turned upward, preserved in perfect, terrifying detail by the sub-zero tomb. His skin was pale marble, his blue eyes were wide open and glassy, staring straight through the ice floor, looking up into the cabin above. In his right hand, wrapped tightly in a thick leather glove, the man was holding an old steel geological survey hammer. Eric fell to his knees, his heart hammering against his ribs so hard it felt like it would crack his sternum. He stared at the face of the frozen climber, paralyzed by sheer terror. But then, as he watched through the pale yellow light of his flashlight, he noticed something that turned his blood colder than the Arctic air. The gloves were not still. Deep inside the thick block of ice, the frozen man's arm shifted slightly. A tiny hairline crack formed near the tip of the steel hammer. Then, right before Eric's eyes, the hand flexed inside the ice, drawing the hammer back a fraction of an inch and striking the underside of the icy ceiling above it. Tap! A small spiderweb of white fractures bloomed in the clear ice right beneath the cabin's wooden supports. The man was not hitting the floorboards from the outside. He was trapped deep within the rising permafrost layer, pushing his way upward, toward the only source of warmth in 50 miles, the heat radiating down from Eric's living room floor. With a muffled groan of shifting glacial pressure, the ice beneath the cabin creaked loudly. The permafrost was expanding, heaving upward as the sub-zero temperatures compressed the underground water pockets. Every hour, the entire frozen mass was rising by half an inch, carrying the frozen climber higher and higher toward the wooden surface. Eric scrambled backward on his hands and knees, terror overwhelming his senses as he dragged himself out from beneath the cabin. He practically threw himself up the icy steps, burst through the front door and slammed it shut, throwing every deadbolt he had. He stood in the middle of his warm living room, panting heavily, his body trembling uncontrollably as snow melted off his parka and dripped onto the floor. He looked down at the floorboards beneath his feet. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was right there, right beneath the thin layer of pine wood he was standing on. It was clearer now, louder than it had ever been. The tip of the hammer was no longer hitting ice. It was striking the very bottom of the floorboards. Eric backed away toward his desk, grabbing his radio microphone with a wet, shaking hand. He frantically flipped the power switch, changing channels, screaming into the static. Longyearbyen, this is Outpost 0. Do you read me? I have an emergency. Please respond, I have an emergency. Static crackled back empty and cruel. The storm was completely blocking the high-frequency radio bands. No one was coming. No one could reach the plateau in a blizzard like this. He was miles away from the nearest human soul, completely alone in the endless winter night. He turned toward his wood-burning stove, his mind racing. If he kept the stove burning, the heat would keep him from freezing to death, but it would also continue to radiate down through the floor, warming the ice below, encouraging the frozen mass to expand and bring the nightmare closer to the surface. If he put the fire out, the cabin would turn into a deep freezer within 2 hours, dropping to 30 below zero, freezing him where he sat. Suddenly, a loud, sharp crack echoed through the small cabin. Eric froze. He slowly turned his head to look at the center of his living room floor. Right in the middle of the dark wooden planking, a thin white line appeared. The wood split slightly, a tiny plume of freezing white vapor, puffing up through the seam like steam from a kettle. Then came another strike, far stronger this time. Thud. The plank buckled upward by 1/4 of an inch. A small shard of wood splintered off, bouncing across the floor. Through the newly formed crack in the floorboards, a gust of sub-zero air blew into the room, carrying with it a faint, sickly sweet smell of wet earth and old wool. Eric backed up until his shoulder blades hit the far wall of the cabin. He clutched his crowbar in both hands, his eyes glued to the splitting wood in the center of the room. He watched as a second plank fractured under the immense pressure from below. Through the widening gap in the floorboards, something moved in the dark. A thick dark glove, dusted with decades of ancient white frost, pushed its way up through the broken wood, its fingers slowly opening and closing as it reached blindly into the warm air of the room. The wind outside roared louder, shaking the outer walls of the cabin as if trying to tear the roof off. But inside, the only sound that mattered was the slow, wet creaking of the floorboards, as the rest of the body began to push its way through the floor, inch by agonized inch, rising from the icy dark into the light. Next, story 3. The high desert of New Mexico did not sleep at night. It simply held its breath. Miles away from the neon glow of Albuquerque, wrapped in an endless blanket of red dirt, dried sagebrush and razor-sharp fence wire, sat Sector 9 decades ago. The land had been used for military testing and chemical waste disposal. Now it was just a vast, dead zone waiting for the government to clean it up. The only building for 10 miles in any direction was a sun-bleached, concrete bunker that looked more like an abandoned bomb shelter than a security station. Inside that bunker sat Maya, working the graveyard shift from midnight to 6 in the morning. Her job was absurdly simple, terribly boring, and paid just enough to cover her tuition. She was hired by a private security firm to monitor the closed-circuit television cameras spread across the restricted perimeter. The firm was terrified of eco-activists breaking in or homeless drifters wandering into contaminated trenches, so they paid Maya to sit in an air-conditioned room surrounded by 12 glowing monitors, drinking lukewarm coffee and filling out hourly log sheets. The security setup was cheap and outdated. 12 black and white monitors hung in 2 rows of 6 on the concrete wall. Each screen displayed a feed from an infrared camera mounted on a tall steel pole somewhere out in the black empty desert. The infrared light turned the desert into a ghostly, glowing world of grey and pale white. Semak bushes looked like pale skeletal hands, and distant rocky hills looked like sleeping monsters. For the first 2 months, Maya's shifts were utterly devoid of excitement. She watched coyotes trot past camera 4, watched the wind blow tumbleweeds past camera 10, and occasionally watched a desert hawk land on top of camera 12. It was a monotonous rhythm that allowed her to read textbooks and listen to soft music through her headphones. Everything changed on a Tuesday during the 2nd week of August. It was 3:12 in the morning. Maya was leaning back in her swivel chair, rubbing her tired eyes, when a sudden flicker on the far left monitor caught her attention. It was camera 7, positioned on the outer edge of the northern sector, looking out over a deep, dry ravine known as Dead Man's Wash. Maya leaned forward, resting her elbows on the metal desk, and squinted at the grey screen. Standing directly in the middle of the frame, about 30 yards from the camera pole, was a figure. It was a woman. She was wearing a simple, light-coloured summer dress that hung loosely around her thin frame. Her long dark hair fell over her shoulders, covering her face entirely. She was not moving. She was not looking around, walking or shivering in the cold night air. She was standing completely still, her chest not even moving with breath, facing straight toward the camera lens. Maya stared at the screen, her heart skipping a beat. The rules were clear. Any unauthorized human presence required an immediate call to the local county sheriff. Maya picked up the heavy black landline telephone, dialed the dispatcher, and reported an intruder at Northern Gate 7. A patrol car was dispatched, but by the time the deputy arrived 45 minutes later, the screen was empty. The deputy drove his utility vehicle along the perimeter fence, shined his searchlight into the wash, and radioed back to Maya, telling her it was probably just a local teenager pulling a prank or a glitch in the old infrared sensor. Maya logged the incident and tried to forget about it. But the next night, at precisely 3:12 in the morning, her eyes pulled away from her book and darted to camera 7. The woman was there again. This time she was closer. Instead of standing 30 yards away near the edge of the ravine, she was standing 20 yards away, right next to a cluster of dried cactus. She wore the same pale dress, her dark hair hanging down, her posture perfectly stiff. And just like the night before, she was staring directly into the lens. A cold prickle of fear traced its way down Maya's spine. She reached for the desk lamp and turned it off, making the security bunker completely dark, except for the light of the monitors. She stared at screen 7 for 20 minutes, expecting the woman to turn, to step, to do anything a normal human being would do. But the figure remained as motionless as a statue. At 3:30, Maya blinked, looked down to grab her coffee cup, and when she looked back up, the screen showed nothing but empty sand and swaying sagebrush. By the 5th night, the phenomenon had become a terrifying ritual. Every single night, as the digital clock on the wall changed from 03:11 to 03:12, camera 7 captured the same image, and every single night, the woman was closer to the camera pole. On the 7th night, Maya decided to stop calling the sheriff. They had already threatened to fine her, company for wasting police resources after finding no footprints, no tire tracks, and no physical evidence of anyone being in the wash. Maya knew she was on her own. She began staying up late before her shifts, diving deep into local news archives, police blotters, and old internet forums, searching for anything related to Sector 9. What she found sent a deep, icy dread settling into her stomach. 23 years ago, before the military fenced off the land, the area surrounding Dead Man's Wash had been the dumping ground for a convicted serial killer named Arthur Vance. Vance had abducted 4 women from nearby highway truck stops over 3 years. When he was finally caught by federal agents in 1999, he confessed to burying his victims out in the desert sand, but he died of a stroke in prison before he could reveal the exact location of his final victim, a 21-year-old college student named Clara Davis. Clara had vanished on her way home from a late-night study session, wearing a pale yellow cotton summer dress. Maya sat back in her chair, the glow of her laptop screen illuminating her pale, horrified face. She pulled up the digitized newspaper. Photo of Clara Davis, even through the grainy black and white scan of the old newspaper. The resemblance was undeniable. The long dark hair, the thin frame, the gentle slant of the shoulders. That night, Maya went to work with a heavy iron, flashlight and a baseball bat, resting beside her control console. She sat in front of the monitors, her breath shallow and quick, watching the digital clock tick closer to 3 in the morning. 03:09, 03:10, 03:11, 03:20. Maya turned her head toward monitor 7. The woman was not 30 yards away. She was not 20 yards away. She was standing 3 feet from the camera lens. Because of the extreme close-up, The camera's infrared lighting illuminated every single detail of the figure. Her pale dress was torn at the hem, caked with dry, dark mud. Her hands hung at her sides, her fingers unnaturally long and thin, the fingernails broken and caked with black dirt, as if she had been clawing her way through feet of hard-packed soil, and for the first time her hair was pushed back from her face. Maya squeezed the arms of her office chair so hard her knuckles turned white. The woman's skin was tight, drawn dark across her cheekbones, but her eyes were not empty sockets. They were wide, glossy, and impossibly clear, filled with a deep, endless fury that seemed to project right through the cathode ray tube screen and into the small bunker room. The woman on the monitor opened her mouth. She did not scream. She did not speak. She simply opened her mouth wider and wider than any human jaw should open, staring directly at Maya through the glass screen. Maya threw her hands over her mouth to muffle a scream. She scrambled backward, knocking her coffee cup off the desk, sending dark liquid splashing across the concrete floor. She stared at Monitor 7, her heart pounding like a trapped bird inside her chest. Then the feed on Monitor 7 flickered once, twice, and died. The screen turned into a grid of fuzzy grey static. Maya gasped, trying to catch her breath. She looked at the static, her chest heaving, waiting for the camera to reboot. "It's just a feed error," she whispered to herself, her voice shaking violently in the quiet room. "It's just an old cable. It's just a camera breaking down." She took a deep breath, trying to regain control of her nerves, and slowly reached down to pick up her spilled cup. As she straightened up, her eyes casually swept across the rest of the monitors on the wall. Monitor 6 was normal. Monitor 5 was normal. Monitor 4 was normal. Monitor 2 was showing the interior pathway, leading up to the bunker's heavy steel security door. Standing right under the yellow floodlight of camera 2, less than 10 feet from the heavy steel entrance of her bunker, was the woman in the pale dress. Maya froze, every muscle in her body locking in sheer, unadulterated terror. The woman on screen 2 was dripping wet with dark, foul-smelling mud, leaving wet footprints on the gravel path. She was staring straight up at the camera dome mounted above the metal door frame. Maya slowly turned her head toward the heavy metal security door at the back of her bunker room. It was locked with a heavy electronic deadbolt, but the door was old, weathered, and held in place by a simple steel frame. A quiet, wet sound echoed from the dark hallway outside her room. Squelch, squelch, squelch. It was the sound of wet, mud-soaked bare feet walking slowly down the concrete corridor toward her office. Maya's breath hitched in her throat. She snatched the baseball bat off the floor, sliding behind her metal control desk, pulling her legs up against her chest. She pointed her flashlight toward the heavy door, her hand trembling so violently the beam of light danced frantically against the dark wall. The footsteps stopped right outside her door. The heavy silence of the desert descended back onto the room, so absolute that Maya could hear the electric hum of the fluorescent light bulb above her head and the heavy thudding of her own frantic heartbeat. Then came the monitor. Maya's eyes shot up to Monitor 1, the camera mounted inside the hallway, looking directly at the entrance of her control office. On the black and white screen of Monitor 1, the woman in the pale dress was standing right in front of the door. Her dark, mud-stained arm reached slowly out toward the heavy brass door handle, her long, pale fingers wrapped around the metal. In the real room, inches away from where Maya sat trembling in the dark, the heavy brass door handle slowly began to turn downward.